Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to moderate the panel. I've got a great panel here that's going to cover all different aspects of reimbursement, regulatory, scale-up, and combinations thereof of drug delivery. I find the subject is getting bigger and bigger every time I look at it, from intraperitoneal delivery of one thing to an inhaler that I might walk down, carry in my pocket. So it's a very broad topic. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what I think some of the future of some of these technologies or techniques are. I have trouble with the interperitoneal one, making a connection, but I might be able to find one in the future. So I just got done writing a book called Moneyball Medicine. It was all about how data is going to change the practice of medicine, and interviewed a number of people in different areas. And when I was thinking about this panel, I was like, oh my God, like you guys are covering, you guys check almost every box that I have in the book, which is, digitization, precision medicine, patients being more aware of their own conditions because of the information the device can deliver, smart pharma, pharmaceuticals wanting to, companies wanting to know that their drug actually got delivered, and being able to do adherence, digital health, which covers into that area, and then obviously, payers wanting to know that I gave something, they took it, it worked, or you can tell me at least that it worked, because I really, you can see the whole movement towards only wanting to pay for what works, as opposed to pay for whatever anybody's given. And so I tried to, you'll forgive my slide, I sort of squashed this together, but some of the things I can tell you that I find fascinating are some of the stuff you guys are doing at Otsuka, obviously companies like Proteus, Propeller Health, which is just literally just putting a small chip with a GPS on an inhaler to an app, and now all of a sudden everybody wants to use that sort of a system because it can prove that you can actually get less emergency room visits. We're not talking necessarily rocket science with a new something, but utilizing technology and data to drive it. I think it also helps with your trials and different areas like that. We're looking at a couple of companies that are digital CROs, where you never have to have the patient ever come in for a review. You can actually do your entire clinical trial digitally based on a drug that they might be taking. You've got companies like Cohero Health, which are also competing against Propeller. Then you've got companies down at the bottom like Evidation Health and OneDrop and IP Analytics and Gluco, which are now able to really crunch the analytics on the data to give back information either to the therapeutic company or directly to the patient. At Evidation, I don't know what the most recent number is, but I think they're tracking like 3 million patients on a daily basis across a number of digital inputs that they get. And you'd really be surprised at how you can see digital biomarkers based on the fact that they're watching these patients on a regular basis. And if they take a drug, they can actually see what's happening next. And so and then you've got AI and machine learning sort of adding another component to that, where the information coming off the system can then respond or give information to the patient or the physician that something is happening, and therefore be able to course correct. And there's numbers of real world examples of those that are happening, where there is a drug device combo that's coming together that's giving some level of information. And then finally, I can sort of looking into the future is, once you get this stuff digitized, which means there's an API somewhere into it, you can see all these interesting companies that technically are not in our world playing a large role in that world, from Amazon to Apple, And then at some point, I think we're going to use these technologies towards adjudication of these technologies to say, are they working? Is that drug working? Did it deliver? If it did deliver, did I get a result? And if I got a result, then I'll pay you for that outcome. And just because I know some conversations that are going on, you can see it moving there incredibly fast. And so I think it does affect regulatory. I think it does affect reimbursement. On some of these things, I would actually say business models might change. Reimbursement as we know it today may not be what it is in the future. I think that is very open to change, and there's already some concrete examples where the company is not being paid by the reimbursement system at all, it's being paid by a patient. Or actually at some point I can see it being paid by the hospital because it does something to manage their patients, keep them healthier in a value-based environment. It's the cost of doing business. And I'm looking at these things all the time, and I find it very fascinating how quickly it's moving. For today, I think we're staying more in today's world, but I'd like to invite the next speaker up at this point, and I don't know if I did. Excellent. So Stephen Rosenberg is the commercial lead of digital, medical, and did I get it? I got it wrong.
I'll take care of it.
Okay,
for you.
thank you.
Yeah.
Devices.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Harry. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Steve Rosenberg. I am the commercial lead for the medical device division and also our digital medicine businesses at Otsuka. What I'm going to do today is walk you through and give an overview of our recent approval of Abilify MySight, which merges technology and medicine together for the treatment of patients with serious mental illness and allows physicians the first objective measure to determine whether the product is the right product that they're taking, and then to optimize and have the appropriate treatment plan. The disclaimer is always important. So what my plan for today is to give you a general overview of our digital medicine system, discuss some of the regulatory pathways that we went through, give what we believe is a little bit of a unique approach for a pharmaceutical company on how we're going to launch, and then provide some recommendations of how the marketplace needs to move in a different direction than where it currently is today for products such as this. So when you take a look at the system, what I'll do is I'll walk you quickly through this. Basically, you have Abilify, which is already an approved drug, and embedded you have a sensor in the pill. Patient takes the pill then sends a signal to the patch. The patch then transmits the data through the phone up into the cloud. Then the information is then moved from the cloud through the patient's phone, through the mobile application, and then through a web-based application, which is utilized, that can be utilized by the care team for the physician, as well as the physician to be able to monitor each patient that they have currently on the product. So when you look at this drug was approved as a drug-device combination, and Cedar was the lead for it. Where we have flexibility and where we can make rapid change is really what we call on the web-based application. That does not need to go through the regulatory process. So that gives us the ability to iterate, provide what is hopefully a more improved tool as time goes on to allow physicians and a care team to manage their patients. Busy slide. What that says, there's a lot of work that was going on. If you look at this over the last 3 years, we started this journey back in 2012. If you look at 2015 forward, there's a minimum of at least 15 different iterations of draft guidance, final guidance. And what it took for us at this point in time was to continue to work through all these different guidance changes to ensure that we had the appropriate steps in place. So it really showed in a pharmaceutical company about being very nimble and being able to be flexible to make the appropriate changes. And a lot of these changes happen through having ongoing dialogue with the FDA as we work towards getting this product approved. So when you look at it, what did that really take? There were 5 divisions that reviewed this product. So you had 5 different bodies, each one with their own objectives going through for the approval of this, even though CDER was the lead. So that involved a lot of coordination. Then you also had some complexity here. So we already had an approved drug, which was Abilify. There already was approved device components, and then there was some unapproved components here. So you had to really merge all of this together, move this through the authorities, have the ongoing dialogue, and ensure that you had an approvable product. And this was really a 5-year journey for us. In addition to that, there were some unique submission components to this. You now had an iPhone, you had an app, and you had videos, which showed how you would utilize the system. So that further added complexity here. Then you could say, well, packaging, well, all products have packaging. But then there were human factors work that needed to be done to ensure that patients, the care team, and also caregivers could utilize the product in a safe and effective manner. So that added in the added layer of human factors evaluation. And then there is, now that you have it approved, when you want to make changes, how do you make those changes? And what guidance and what guide do you use? And that's where post-approval changes really involve a comparability protocol that we have to use. Once again, though, the dashboard is separate from that. I kind of like this slide, not so much for the cartoon element of it, but it really shows what the adoption curve looks like in technology. You're going to have your innovators in the beginning that will jump onto your product and be interested and will understand some of the bugs and the kinks that may go on with this. But you have to continue to iterate through this, and then eventually will have your early majority, your late majority, and then your laggards. They go, oh, this has been out there and it's been out there for 5 years, and they look at it, it's like a brand new product. So that's really with the adoption curve. What we thought we've done differently and what we plan on doing differently is our commercialization approach is a small, focused, and controlled approach, which is a little different for a pharmaceutical company. We're not going out with a national scale launch. What we're doing is looking towards a select group of health plans or payers and providers that we can work with, learn with, grow with, and iterate with to eventually have the ideal product to then go to a national scale. What we do is we really listen to the voice of the customer, and then once again iterate from what we learn from the customers, make the appropriate changes, go back into the marketplace with those changes, and then get to a place where we're ready for a full-scale launch. Because what we want to do is continue to enhance the customer experience and the user experience to the MySite system. So what does the landscape look like? When we look at our approach and to how we're going to establish value, you look at the traditional P&T committees where they put drugs on the formulary. And then you look at the data generation cycle and how do we really generate the data to show value in the system here. And what you do is you work with really both sides of the plans. You have the pricing part of that, and then you also have the value generation part here. And then identifying in collaboration what are the appropriate metrics to determine value. We will have ours, the plan will have theirs, we merge those together, we integrate into their systems, and then once again, it's a really balancing act here of the medical benefit and the pharmacy cost. That's really putting those all together to then having the appropriate collaboration agreement. Really, in conclusion here, when we look at the healthcare system and how we're going to have to move forward with pathways, part of the education part of this is how do you change behavior, right? Physician, you're adding now digital technology, you're adding a dashboard, you're asking the care team and or the physician to start to mobilize with that data, share the data with the patient, build a plan with the patient to ensure you have, whether it's the right drug, the right method of treatment, or what would be the appropriate next steps for that patient. From a regulation perspective, is now regulating and providing opportunities to make the appropriate software changes in a quick and fast manner, even though there's an approval process as part of that, because we're looking at constantly evolving this. You could be looking at 2 to 3 changes in any given year. If you think back to a pharmaceutical product, you typically file your NDA, you get your drug approved, and that's kind of the end of the interaction unless you're going to change your delivery system or you're going to add on a new indication. But once again, there's years of time. We're looking for quick iterations. The government part of this too is the value-based contracting. We don't believe there's going to be the same old contracting process. It's going to be value-based. Use the system. Do we see a reduction in cost? And we'll have the data to be able to monitor those reductions in cost. That's going to be the key moving forward. And then workflow integration, whether it's with a payer, whether it's with EHR systems, to have the ability and be dynamic enough to be able to integrate within the systems and be able to leverage the technology. So I'm now going to pass the baton to Pam.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Hello, I'm Pam Wiegraff with IQVIA. First, I'd like to thank MassBio and Paul Hartung for inviting me to participate today. And I'm also very grateful that MassBio saw fit to match the ribbon to my outfit. So there you go. Okay, what I'd like to do is let you know, first of all, just a snippet. My background is the medtech industry, all manner of medical devices, diagnostics, with heavy emphasis on electromechanical software controlled devices, and also software as medical devices, drug delivery devices, implants, active, passive, etc. So in my long career, I've covered quite a few different areas. I currently head up the MedTech regulatory group for IQVIA. For those of you who are scratching your head, IQVIA, who would that be? Well, once upon a time, there was a company called Quintiles, and there was another company called IMS Health. Those two companies merged approximately 2 years ago, and after about a year of the mouthful of Quintiles IMS, we gave the marketing group a task to rebrand, and thus we came out with IQVIA. So first, what I'd like to do is have a step back for a minute. I deal with a lot of different biopharma companies, biotech companies, and of course, medtech companies are deep in my blood. What we often forget is that medtech and biopharma, they are different, and for very good reasons. As Stephen just pointed out, the development cycle for a drug, very different than for a device. Whenever I'm meeting with biopharma or biotech companies, I ask them, consider your iPhone. How often does Apple come out with a new iPhone? Well, guess what? That's what happens with medical devices. Many of the more innovative devices that are based on software. So you also need to think of the regulatory framework. When I talk to folks who are involved in CDER and CBER, they view CDRH kind of as the Wild West. Because we were running free and clear of any regulation, overt regulation, if you will, until 1976. Of course, I was in kindergarten then, so I wouldn't know. But at any rate, 1938, 1976, one can draw the conclusion that the regulatory infrastructure in CDER and CBER is far more mature and regimented than what you're going to see at CDRH. Well, there's another reason for that. I pointed to the short product life cycle. You have to iterate very, very quickly. Ipso facto, you want a regulatory infrastructure within CDRH, or frankly, other regulatory authorities that can support that type of rapid innovation. You also have the number of different medical devices. With all due and humble respect to biopharma and biotech, medtech has 500,000 different types of medical devices. Now, some of them might be tongue depressors or bed sheets used to prevent pressure sores, but nevertheless, imagine the span of knowledge that needs to reside in CDRH to deal with all that. That also means, because of the sheer number of products, they must be as agile as any bureaucracy can be. Last but not least, I can recall I was doing a management fellowship in Washington, D.C., and the famous Temple report was published. How many of you remember or know of Bob Temple? Aha, okay. Well, the good Bob Temple published a report that compared the clinical studies that were conducted by medical device firms back in the early 90s to what was required for drugs. Oh my goodness. The medical device studies were woefully inadequate. And so CDRH was put on notice to increase the quality of their clinical studies. But the reality is, not all medical devices lend themselves to the gold standard, which you would all view as an RCT, right? So it's very important to be cognizant of these differences, whether you have medtech capability within your company or you're partnering with the medtech company for your drug delivery device. You've seen some of this from Stephen's slide. The way I look at it is devices that are beyond the pill. And we'll hear from other panelists about the types of devices that we'll see there. What I'm seeing is the influence of technology. Of course, ongoing miniaturization, microfluidics, the ability to put a sensor in a pill. So all these advances in technology, they're not based on chemistry per se. They're based on the actual drug delivery device proper. And so the convergence of medtech with biopharma is going to depend greatly on what are the characteristics of the drug that the delivery device needs to be able to support, and vice versa. The other aspect of that is the digital health aspect, and Stephen touched on that. Thank goodness, Bakul Patel, he heads up the digital health group within CDRH, and he had been in industry before he joined CDRH. That is a huge benefit, and in fact, many of the individuals in his group came from industry. So they understand how companies work. And I view that as a huge contribution to why the digital health program has moved along as well as it has. Stephen alluded to this, and I'll touch on it in a minute, but because of the 21st Century Cures Act that went into effect in December of 2016, that also included requirements for medical devices. That gives FDA, CDRH in particular, even more flexibility. Now, combination product pathways, I thought about this, and you can't easily generalize what would be the best pathway. I mean, Stephen outlined what Otsuka did for their product, and I looked at that and I thought, yes, absolutely, it is that complicated. It can be that complicated. It can also be much simpler. On as many occasions as possible, I encourage companies to think of the drug delivery device not just as a single entity, but in fact as a system. You're going to have, the primary drug delivery device, you may have components. If some of those components have already gone through the CDRH process, let's say they're 510(k) cleared, just point to them. And it's very important early on to think through the regulatory strategy for the drug delivery device, if that will run separate from your NDA or BLA. Now, there are many cases, pre-filled syringes, the classic. There are many cases, if it's a pre-filled delivery device, you can pack that all into the NDA or the BLA or the IND before that. It goes right into the CMC section. But there are many, many cases where those need to run parallel paths. In some cases, if you're working with a partner, they may not want to share all their secrets with you. They also may not want to go for, maybe they have that product available, they don't want to go for a PMA. Class 3 high risk, a lot of heavy lifting. Well, what to do? Well, there are device master files. Those allow you to proceed. It allows your partner to protect what they may view as trade secret and proprietary. And there you go. So I think, I put here 3 different options. They're kind of very obvious for those of you here who have regulatory backgrounds or have been in this space for a very long time. There's no rocket science there. I had a little fun with my icons, and that's all good. But what I wanted to emphasize there is that those are merely starting points. The questions that I typically ask companies, the first one is, what is your objective? What is it you want to accomplish? Because from my perspective, your regulatory strategy should inform your objective. It should not dictate it. So, enough on that. What's new for combination products? As I mentioned, and Stephen showed a lovely time scale, FDA, various groups within FDA have been cranking out guidance documents. Well, they don't just do that because they think it's a good thing. They do that because Congress, through legislation that has been enacted, requires them somehow to implement the legislation. And an excellent way for them to do that, of course, is through draft and final guidance. We all probably know, or we may know, may not, that draft guidance, technically speaking, should not apply to our activities because it's draft. However, it provides a very, very clear indication of what FDA, be it CDER, CBER, or CDRH, are thinking and the way they're making decisions. So I have presented the argument on occasion that, well, it's a draft guidance, so it doesn't apply. And I have been successful in some cases. But I've also been unsuccessful. So I consider it a coin toss. And I leave it up to the company to decide what position do you want to take on this, because it's a measure of your appetite for risk. If you want to push the envelope, here are the options. If you're just wanting to get this over with, here's your other option. So the different guidance documents, whether they're draft or final, for those of you in regulatory, they're super useful tools. They are also subject to interpretation. So please, 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 if you're from smaller companies and you're under the impression that you can go to the FDA website, search for guidance, read it, and be able to inform your colleagues as to what's important to do, rest assured, interpretation is very important. And yes, I am a bit older, and yes, that experience does make a difference. So just to keep that in mind. The last parting thought I want to leave with you is that CDER approaches things a bit differently, as does CBER and CDRH. Human factors, they look at it differently, but they are working to work better together. It's in their interests, and it most certainly is in ours. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Paul Just. I'm the Senior Principal for Global Healthcare Economics at ICON. I'll give you a really quick background for me. I'm a practicing on both sides of the healthcare continuum. I started out as a residency-trained clinical pharmacist, worked at academic medical centers as integrated member of the healthcare team. From there, I went to Premier, an alliance of about 2,000 hospitals and health systems in the US, where I built a clinical pharmacy program and was involved in technology appraisals, helping people select what would be the best choice, and generally making life difficult for manufacturers who didn't have evidence, which was a lot of them. And then I transitioned into industry because I figured out, well, maybe by joining industry, he won't harm us as much. And that's where I really focused on health economics, trying to prove the value story and use the lessons of a career in patient care to focus on making things available. So the beginning focus is, it's all about value today. Value is the currency of access to good health care. Market access is a concept you're going to hear a lot about. It's defined differently by many people. I like to keep things pretty simple. The simple definition of market access, to me, it's an integration of many disciplines, but it's all about identifying actual or potential barriers to patients and caregivers having access to products that help patients get better. So you either want to identify and knock down existing barriers or identify potential barriers before they're raised and make sure you never let them get raised. And the way to do that is by having good evidence. So the most common market access barrier, what do you think it is? Will they pay for the product? Okay, so that's number one. And you really do, as we heard in the previous panel, have to start planning for that right away, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The concept of value-based purchasing, shift to administratively led purchasing decisions, that's about the loss of physicians being able to choose what items they prefer to use. So what's going on in healthcare today? There's a lot of large healthcare systems that are buying up physician practices, and the physicians now work as part of a bigger team where they have to play ball and help the healthcare system they're part of provide more value. And what does that generally mean? It means provide therapy at a cheaper cost to save money and ensure the profitability of the healthcare system. So the barrier busters are really about identifying proactively various approaches to overcome and answer the questions that will be raised about, can you prove you have a product that does what you claim it does? So what is value? Again, I like the very simple definition that Michael Porter put out in New England Journal of Medicine many years ago. It's health outcomes achieved per dollar spent, but it's really a lot more than that. It's really about, it's not just the cost of the product. It's about how the cost of the product fits into the overall health care over the time period, the time horizon that a patient benefits. And again, we're going to explore that in more depth. But that's supposed to be a black cloud. It came out brown. But the black cloud over everything is cost reduction, where all you're trying to do is get a cheaper product, and you don't look at quality outcomes and how holistically that product fits into the overall care pattern for the patient over their remaining time of life is very short-sighted. So don't try and read it, but this is about where things start today. Value frameworks. Value frameworks have been conceived probably over the past 5 years. Various organizations have put them together. But for those of you in the device, pharma, biotech, combination product space, if you want to convince your executive management teams about why you need to think about value, reimbursement, and who's going to pay for this from the inception, is you take a look at some of these value frameworks. AdvaMed on the right has one for diagnostic products as well as for medical devices. We have ICER, ISPOR. There's numerous ones out there. They're worth looking into. They will help you create the case for why you need to prove value. And it's really about proving differentiating value. Why should somebody pick your product over another one for the premium price you're likely to ask for? So this is just, again, a conceptual approach. There's many different types of value you can identify. A health economist helps quantify the differentiating value. So it's about identifying the outcomes. We heard about efficacy and safety. Well, those are FDA issues. But remember, you're also dealing with CMS and commercial payers who look at a different standard, medical necessity, and reasonableness. So evidence for both pathways needs to be made available, and that's why there are some approaches to blending those over time. But looking at this, thinking about this early on is critical. For combination products at large, and this is a great conference to me because it's some really good concepts of what combination products can really do. And from my 18 years in the medical device industry, one of the things I've conceptualized all the time is that a medical device isn't just a thing to look at. It's something that typically enables a procedure to take place. So whether that be an implantable device or something as simple as a medical scalpel or a new medical scalpel, it's about enabling a procedure. And that's what these combination drug delivery products do, is they enable a new method, the single compartment method we heard about, of treating patients. There's a lot of value opportunity there if we can talk about it, identify it, focus on it, and constructively design our protocols to pull that value forward in an influential manner to convince decision makers and payers that they need to make this product available. So what do you have to do? The goals are prove that you get additional value compared to either entity alone. Synergy would be great. If you have two wonderful products that each are innovative, it would be wonderful to put them together and show that they do more than additive value. The other thing is it can't be inferior or equal. We also heard that in the first panel. Really, for a premium price today, you have to focus on proving some superiority. You have to pull that out. Now, differentiating value is also different for a medical device because unlike pharma and biotech products where you give the product, it's done, you have an outcome, the quality of the product as it goes into the patient is what determines the outcome. With a medical device, there are many factors beyond the control of the manufacturer that are in play. Was the procedure performed adequately and appropriately that put the device in place? So the elephant in the room is something like surgical experience. With a lot of medical devices, one of the things that happens is you have a learning curve that you don't have with pills. What do? You take a pill, right? You swallow it, it's done. But with a medical device, when a surgeon is learning how to use a new medical device, the majority of the evidence suggests that the first 20, 40, 60 cases may not have the same outcome as those once he gets past that learning curve. So there's many more factors like that that differentiate the evidence requirements for medical devices from products, but you got to keep them in mind. Key differentiators. So innovative products are really where it's all about today. Superiority, to whom does it matter? So let's get into the concept of the stakeholder. When we talked about value, value is defined very differently by different people. As a patient, what's value to me? I want to be better. I want to be able to live my life the way I've always lived it. I want to be able to provide for my family and do everything I've done before. To a payer, what's value? It's cheaper. To a facility today, especially under the Accountable Care Organization or the episodic care, DRG systems, what's value? Well, there's a cost a hospital has or a facility has of providing care. There's a reimbursement they get. And the difference between their cost of providing the care and reimbursement is their opportunity for profit. When we introduce a new product that costs more to that system, we're shrinking their potential profitability. And now that they're responsible for care costs after discharge out to most often 90 days, any complication that occurs is a major confounder that hurts the value of the product. So you have to show that you have better outcomes. We're able to look at some things like real-world data and evidence, particularly for pharmaceutical products, but not so much as easily for medical devices, because real-world claims databases don't track what particular medical device was used in performing a procedure. We could look at the procedure, but we can't tell you that manufacturer A, B, C, or D's product was used in that procedure. How to do that, there are some specialized ways to approach it. That will be a more telling difference in the future. So differentiation. The key, if you take nothing else away from my comments today, this is the one to take. Who pays and when must align with who benefits and when. That's the bottom line of value in healthcare, because we have clearly defined periods of value return. And as a manufacturer designing your protocols to prove the value of your product, the clinical outcome, and as meaningful and worthwhile, you have to make sure that you target it to the right stakeholder. So if you have a product that is potentially life-altering or it requires permanent treatment outcomes or permanent treatment, you're going to look at this over a 24-month period. But if you're a company that has something like a joint replacement, and that joint replacement's a premium price, and it's a premium because it reduces the revision risk at 10 years, but you're at an accountable care organization that's looking at 90 days of cost, and to get that product into a patient that reduces their 10-year risk of revision costs you $3,000 more, are you likely to do it? No. And the pressure is on manufacturers to bring the prices down. So the learning is, as a manufacturer, if your benefit is long-term, also try and find some short-term benefits to intermingle into that story, because you're going to need both. So we have a lot of stakeholders on the left over here to look at, but this is the concept of that treatment continuum. And hopefully what you're going to see here is the distinction of the 90-day period, which is the episode of care I talk about, versus an 18 to 24-month period, which is the commercial insurance persistence rate, which they think they're losing patients. So if they don't get their value back in that period of time, they're not as interested in paying a price premium for it up front. And then the period beyond 24 months is the really long-term value. And that commonality, how you figure out where this continuum breaks with your product, is really critical in your early design of clinical trial outcomes. Case study that I wanted to show is the concept of the artificial pancreas. Why did I pick this one? Because it has a lot of the elements I'm trying to focus on. The most important one is this took years to be able to put together. The first thing that had to be shown with the concept of an artificial pancreas was that tight blood sugar control was really great for patients. It reduced complications, reduced morbidity, and improved survival. With that as a foundation, companies designing these products went for pre-market authorizations, PMAs, as opposed to 510Ks or de novos, because with an approved indication from a PMA, it was a better market access barrier. But, and we should probably take a time out to explain briefly that the concept of 510K clearance is that your product is being approved on the basis of being substantially equivalent to a predicate device. So 90% of medical devices are approved under a 510K pathway or higher. And that means you're in the hole to begin with, because you're asking for a 20% premium, but you're already said, well, I got a 510K, so I'm substantially equivalent to this cheaper product that's on the market. So you have to have clinical evidence to overcome that. You'll get that automatically with the PMA. Professional guidelines for the artificial pancreas. Several organizations built in the concepts of why continuous blood glucose monitoring was good, why insulin pump infusions were good for certain patients, et cetera. Coding, coverage, reimbursement. Remember, one doesn't guarantee the other, but they were able to convince a substantial number of commercial insurers to cover these types of products. And somehow they got minimized in this, but there are actually certain HCPCS codes from CMS that were identifiable for commercial insurers. And then we also have, again, aligning stakeholders. There's a collection and interpretation of data code that allows a provider to get paid. So I'm going to conclude with this concept that what we're trying to do is help people understand you have to change the paradigm of evidence development and design. On the far left is the way it typically is. Clinical protocols are designed. Resource utilization endpoints are identified because you ask in a health economist too late. The design's been done. The result that you get may not have been completed to the right targeted stakeholder it needed to be. The new paradigm, the approach that really we need to think about today, is start with defining the value framework. Identify the differentiating value. Make sure you know that you're including resource utilization endpoints that will show that to be beneficial. Create a stakeholder value map. So understand the differentiating values as perceived and defined by individual stakeholders. Look for alignment, fix it where it's not aligned, and target the greatest alignment as your key evidence strategy. Design your clinical protocol now, and then your results can be analyzed in the context prospectively of that framework and communicate the results effectively to the right people. So health economics helps in all this. I'm going to end there, and if you have questions, I'll be around after. Thanks. I'll turn it over.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jess Ballinger. Does it go? There we go. When Paul and Maria asked if I would join the panel today, actually part of the conversation was to introduce myself as someone who's been in large pharma and actually now in a small startup, one of the Bob Langer startups, of course, and Amy Schulman's our CEO of Lindra. I think talking about this, I'm going to use Lindra as the case study in order to articulate some of the challenges. But I'm going to lean on both I've been in the industry for 25 years. I too was at kindergarten. I have kids in college. I know I don't look like that. That always comes up. You cannot possibly have 2 children that are in college. I do. And I was at Pfizer for about just under 19 years. I was at Biogen for about 5 years. In both of those organizations, I led the device development organization in Pfizer for probably 11-something years. I was at Biogen for 5 and led the product and device development organization. The gift of both of those teams is that I've seen a lot of companies we were either acquiring, buying, spinning out, selling off. I've seen a lot of technologies. And actually, I was looking at the list today. I've worked in almost every route of drug delivery that I can imagine and been in it. I was just looking, thinking, wow, I could talk about growth hormone. I could talk about hemophilia. I could talk about intrathecal with Spinraza. I could talk about a lot of different things. So I thought, actually, when I put the slides together, Lindra was an interesting parallel to that because the complexity is no different in a large or small company. And the choices that you have to make really aren't any different because the environment we're in is completely similar and complex. And so I'm going to tell the story of Lindra, not because of Lindra and selling it, but because it talks about the funding stream and kind of the choices we have to make in this scale-up technology to be able to, in this case, complement all the other speakers in both panels and the trade-offs of doing the investment in the technology itself. So actually the manufacturing processes, the kinds of technology you choose, and what you have to care about and scale up and be ready for the commercial launch. So I'm going to have a go at that and see how this works out. Lindra has only been in existence for about 3 years. We are actually embarking in our clinical stage programs at this point. But what does that mean? And the reason I put this up here was our funding slide. So you will see last Friday our biggest change recently is we just announced an $80 million joint venture with the GDCC, part of the Quark Venture Funds, to have single entry into the Chinese market with our Lindra dosage form. We have a strategic partnership with Allergan, which is both already communicated that it's focused on Alzheimer's, and then there's a to-be named option and hasn't been disclosed yet. And you'll see a lot of NIH funding and Gates Foundation funding. So we have about a third equity base, about a third grant base, and about a third strategic partners. So frankly, we do a lot of creative ways to fund the company, and we think about it, like Maria said, we think about it every single day, and partially because it takes a lot of effort and cash to be both a clinical stage company and a technology company that's investing in manufacturing so that we can actually commercialize. Heading into early stage clinical studies, when we started thinking about what the technology needed to be, when you think about Lindra, and I'll specifically talk about what we do in Lindra, but think about it as either patch pumps and, like Evan was saying, either in auto-injectors, it doesn't matter. If you have a molecule that you've got to get into the body either through a container and it's going to touch glass and plastic and it's going to be sterile or not sterile and it's going to go either into the body as an implant, go into the eye as an insert, go in through an inhaled route, which we've been in dry powder inhalers. All of this is very similar because every choice you make affects either the safety and efficacy of the product, the scalability of the technology, the cost at the final endpoint of the technology, and in the end, we've all talked about reimbursement. It's all about the value proposition and who's going to pay for this at the end. And so you can use our technology and then just swap out whichever ones you want. It doesn't matter because the same kinds of questions you'd be asking yourself. So Lindra is actually an ultra-long-acting oral therapy. It starts, it has a bit of a picture, I'll show you the next page, but the patient just takes it like it's a normal capsule. So when you get it at home, it's not going to feel any different. So that's already a human factor kind of consideration. We are already interacting with the emerging technologies team at the FDA, so we're already having conversations about what our regulatory environment's going to be. We are anticipating and have been communicated to, our predicates are drugs, so we are a drug, but we do have a lot of things that look like a device in our dosage form, even though we don't call it a device. So we still have to think about human factors and kind of consider that if somebody's going to get either, and at this point it could be packaged into blisters or it could be packaged into a bottle, but it's going to come to them like they normally would see. It's about the size of a fish oil capsule, so it's a 00 size capsule, so you have to consider how someone's actually going to, only once a week or longer, which we actually have a lot of animal studies in our preclinical program that we can demonstrate we can go a bit longer. You're going to see somebody's going to swallow it. It needs to pass through the esophagus, get into the stomach. The capsule then dissolves and opens up into what we call a stellate or a star form dosage form, and that needs to stay in the stomach for whatever duration we tune it to. And then it will release the medication, and then at the end of that, we ask it to leave the body safe and effectively at a predetermined time, passing through the GI tract as kind of indigestible food. So pretty tough to ask a system to do all of that stuff and do it effectively and safely. So what is it? Because that's part of the choices you make when you start down either a new product or you're thinking about how to do these things creatively. And I would tell you, it's no different when I was at Pfizer or when I was at Biogen. The choices we make to either to deliver hemophilia products or to deliver something as important as maybe Atia's in the back in the Biogen team. She's still taking care of this even though I left. Aducanumab for Alzheimer's is a very large volume biologic for injectable. So you got to think about when people are going to be doing this, if you're going to add technology to it, you got to be sure that people can do what you actually give them, and then you got to make sure the technology does what it's supposed to do. We've decided, and through the team with Gio Traverso and Andrew Bellinger and Bob Langer, and then Amy, of course, as our CEO, when they founded the company, Bob's most famous saying is you can't ask a material to do more than one thing, and it becomes incredibly true in the Lindra dosage form. So the way that you look at this is we started looking at materials that had already been proven safe or used some other way within some other FDA-approved products, even though we hadn't done it in the oral route, because it's key. We didn't want to introduce new excipients or new risks from a safety profile, because as you're embarking on new technology, adding not just new medicines and new plastics or new devices, but what's going to happen? And since this stays in the body, if it introduces other materials that aren't safe for the body, or we haven't proven it, that's a pretty big hurdle for us to take on. So what you'll see is that the dosage form is actually made up in the star, and if I had a pointer, I would point. The things that are white, that are all out at the arms, that's where the medicine is in a polymer matrix, and that's where it stays and it's released from. So we control, the drug delivery is literally controlled in just that part of the arms. The drug delivery, there's a couple of mechanisms that we have to control, both from the arm itself and from some coatings that we put on there. So all of those materials are really important to dose dumping, to safety and PK profiles, and to side effect profiles. And why am I saying that? Because actually then the manufacturing process to make those arms impacts the drug delivery whenever it gets into the body. So as you start to scale up now, if you don't actually pick your manufacturing technologies that can be robust, that can be reproducibly made either at hundreds or millions or hundreds of millions, depending on the area that you're going to be in, it won't be viable from your phase 1 to your phase 3 program. And so you're going to need to be able to, if you look back at that funding, we're a Series A company right now, thinking about Alzheimer's, diabetes, really schizophrenia, thinking about really big disease areas that have hundreds of millions of dosage forms we have to make. And we need to project now that the dosage form that we make can be made reliably and scale up that manufacturing technology pretty rapidly to get to even a phase 3 study to be able to treat the patients. So the arms themselves are hot melt extruded. The black circles, or the black things, are on purpose. They're what we call the disintegrating matrix. They also are extruded. That is the key to the 7 days, or to whatever we call gastric residence. That particular part is the only part that disintegrates. Everything else doesn't change shape, size, or anything. It stays exactly as it looks. Those arms are there. They are then non-contact welded through actually a heat welding stage. And again, missing the pointer, and apologies for that, but you have this core that's in the middle that's injection molded, which gives it this flexibility and the ability for this thing to be folded up into a capsule. And then the disintegrating matrix is welded to the core, and the arms are welded to the disintegrating matrix. All of those are welded at one time together to make the actual stellate dosage form. And each component does something very specific. So if we change the manufacturing processes through this time in this scale up, we'll end up in a position that maybe we change our residency, maybe we change our PK profiles in the arms, maybe we actually have a different safety profile completely. So I was thinking about how to actually really talk about, if you're scaling up, what does it feel like, and what kind of decisions do you have to make along the way? With those decisions we took to pick things that could be known materials, to be able to use known manufacturing processes. Evan talked about being completely novel in that and building something from scratch. We are completely novel in that we've used materials and known processes but put them in a different shape, size that have never been done before. So the novelness for us actually comes into the final assembly and encapsulation processes. But the decisions that we have been taking all along this in order to do the investment strategies, at phase 1, we're at, let's say, thousands of units we can make. It's pretty manual intensive. We are already, for those that speak device terms, we are already at a semi-automated kind of system for our assembly and our encapsulation processes, which means that we're starting to take the human out of the manufacturing process to manage the reproducibility. But we still have a lot of manual interventions where if we have a partner that makes the injection molded core, we have another partner that makes the arms and the disintegrating matrix, we bring that to either Lindra or to another partner to do the final assembly, which is really that welding step and that encapsulation. And then we do global distribution. We're already working in the UK and Australia and other parts of the world, so already things like how are we going to package it? How is it going to get where it needs to get for globals? And we work with the Gates Foundation, so it's very obvious that we need Zone 4B stability processes, that we can actually have a stable product at 5 years shelf life at the time that we distribute. Let's say we launch our malaria products with them. They've got to go into some pretty remote parts of the world, and that they need to get there and still work the way that we wanted it to work, which was this thing folded up in a capsule, sitting on a shelf in a package. The patient takes it out, and all the things that we just said still work as we said it was going to work. They swallow it, it gets to the stomach safely, opens up and stays like it should, and then passes as it should. 100% of the design choices we make, either in the physical design or in the manufacturing technology, that we choose impact whether all of those things could be met. And at the end, every stage of clinical study, I'd say being in drugs and being in devices and being in combo products, they're really not different questions. It's just different levels of risk you carry and different levels of unknown. So as you do a phase 1 study and the medicine's proving itself out, whether it even has a mechanism of action and can be safe, you're not asking any different questions of the Linder dosage form right now when we're in phase 1 than you would a medicine. But the complications are, as you scale up to make tablets, you scale up with already well-proven, or even sterile products with syringes and vials these days. They're so well-known, and there's so much high-volume capability to manufacture that, even the lyophilization products that Evan was talking about. So you don't really need to carry the risk of talking about how you're going to, you just need to know that you want to invest in the capacity, but you're probably not figuring out new ways to do it. Then whenever you start adding all the digital health, I've been in digital health as well, and you add that to a patch pump or an insulin pump, and you start adding all of these things. When you start in each stage of the clinical study, the payers, the health economics, we are always asking, what's the value of adding that technology? And so every time you get feedback from a clinical study, whether that be a human factor study or an actual phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, we end up changing the design of the dosage form, or we end up changing the design of the package, which then goes back into the loop of the manufacturing processes. So what we've tried to do in what I would have done at Pfizer, what we did do at Biogen, we constantly thought about what would our infrastructure need to be, what would our supply chain need to be, how was it going to get where it needed to go, and could we make the decisions today to do the scale up? So back to the funding, back to the how do you use your money wisely, and how do you get ready for, if I want to launch a product in 5 years, and it's going to be a 300 million unit product, whether it's an auto-injector or a Linder dosage form, we need to start scaling at least 3 years before that launch, because we're going to have to go into high cavitation tooling, we're going to have to go into fully automated assembly, we're going to have to do a lot of things that actually take a very long time to do, even when you freeze the technology. And so the last example I would say is sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. It's very dangerous. I actually wasn't a part of this program, but it's very dangerous for me to always bring it up because it's a perfect example. I try to honor my Pfizer legacy and talk about Exubera, which was inhaled insulin, a little bit. Our team was working on the second generation when we launched the first generation. And everybody knows that dosage form or that device as being a very large system, And so part of the regulatory feedback and clinical feedback was it was new technology, and it was people were starting to believe in inhaled insulin as a route of mechanism, but they couldn't change the technology through the development path because nobody knew the impact of that integrated system on the actual administration into the lungs and trying to get insulin where it should be. So we had to freeze that design. We couldn't really touch it for like 10 years. There were so many parts in that device. There were so many things that happened in that our whole plan was to launch a brand new device once we had the first generation on the market. So we started building the second generation even 3 years before we had the first one actually approved. There was a lot of money going into inhaled insulin out of the Pfizer days. And in the end, people look at us and thought, that was a huge mistake. Why would you ever make a device that looked like that? Why would you ever do those things? Well, all of the things I just said played into it. It was the scale up. You had to invest early. You had to be committed. You had to, really be bullish about it. It was a brand new route of administration for insulin. People didn't know how it was going to work. And once they knew they could make it safely for the human to use, it was frozen until we could actually get on the market and prove that people needed it. It was time, it was risk, and in the end, it was a great product, but it just didn't meet the unmet need. So I'd say there's a lot of things you should consider whenever you're doing a scale-up around the technology itself to ensure that you can meet all those stakeholders that all of the other teams have actually talked about. And that's it.
So do we have a whole other day to go over everything that we just talked about? Because I think we need something like a whole day to go through each one of these issues. Well, if my watch is correct, we have 6 minutes? Okay, all right. So it's interesting because when you said 2012, I think you said, which I was like, did they even know about the data, side of it in 2012 of where we'd be today. So obviously you guys were way first, relatively speaking, interacting with the FDA. And do you think that plays a role in, I mean, if you're first, it's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because there may not be anybody there that has that experience like the person you said from industry that's there now. So how much do you think that played a role in?
Yeah, I think, you know, you bring up an interesting point. It did start back in 2012, and it really was almost on a blank sheet of paper for the most part, because what was the business model going to be? How would you execute against it? Yeah, we knew there was a data component of it, but how do you show value for the data by the time you launch? But in actuality, we were going through, if you go back to one of my earlier slides, it was about continuing to go through the regulatory process because it was all uncharted. I believe, I wasn't there for the very beginning of it, but there was ongoing dialogue, both proactive and reactive, you know, with the FDA, because it did channel through a variety of different arms of the FDA, and starting from ground zero is what it was. And you know, we did not get the first approval initially. We had to go back and do more work, because I think the FDA was also learning along the way, and I think you had brought that up, it is very complex, and you have to be very agile as an organization to be able to deal with all the ebbs and flows that are going to happen.
Yeah, when I think about Propeller Health, I mean, they came significantly after you guys, and it seemed like they were able, I don't want to say their path was clear, but it was clearer from a regulatory perspective, and also they had an idea from an proving economics of how that came together, but I think they had to have a combination team. So asking you two from a regulatory and reimbursement, how integrated these days do you have to be compared to days past in how people are looking at value?
Yeah, I would say with regard to FDA, an ongoing issue is how well the centers work and play with each other. And the FDA commissioner is aware of that. He actually visited the Boston area not too long ago. It's a topic, I'm the regulatory advisor to MassMedic, and I fondly bring that topic up every time a new FDA commissioner comes. So you have that issue in terms of how they interpret things. To your point, is it good to be first or second? This is a famous lawyerly regulatory answer. It depends. I'm a firm believer in interact, collaborate, involve FDA as soon as practical. You have to have something real to talk about, otherwise you're wasting their time, and they don't like that so much. But that early interaction is really key. Jeff Shuren, the head of CDRH, is very much promoting the joint CDRH CMS program. Thus far, companies have been very slow to participate because they don't want to be the guinea pig.
And there's not enough people on either side necessarily to handle it simultaneously.
And CMS is lagging CDRH a bit in their enthusiasm, shall we say. But I think being first has a lot of benefit in terms of you get to set the precedents. You get to set the bar. Does it require more investment of time and effort? No doubt about it.
Yeah. So looking at it from the reimbursement perspective, I mean, I'm seeing, especially on the diagnostic side, is if you're not in lockstep, like everybody working together, you're never going to get that product through. I mean, we look at Foundation One's approval recently. How do you see the interaction and the play? If you were running a company, how would you make sure that all those pieces come together?
Well, speaking from the internal side of things, what's always been critical to me is the interactivity between the different internal teams. So a specific example working with regulatory to me may relate to the claim language. That you clearly have identified what that differentiating value is and reflect it appropriately in the claim. Because a misword here or there in the claim can dramatically influence your opportunity to market it to its maximum potential target.
I would just like to add to that a very early experience. I was working for a small startup in the early 2000s, and we designed a pivotal study solely focused on a device now, a pivotal study that included endpoints for health economics as well as for FDA, and it ended up being a monster. The study, I think, required enrollment of 2,200 subjects. Typically, for a medical device company, you fall off your chair. I'm sure many of the investors did. FDA kept pointing out, we only need like 800 patients. What are you doing? The company persisted, and yeah, they got through PMA, but it never met the bar for reimbursement.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, I think, is making sure that the differentiator you're identifying isn't subtle. Because the more subtle it is, the more patients you're going to require to get that statistically significant difference. So identifying when and how you're going to do a comparison is also critically important. And you raise the issue of the randomized controlled trial for medical devices. And I think the FDA is more forgiving than a technology appraisal authority about not having randomized controlled data. They've actually published a review about a year ago, or a little over, identifying that it's not always possible to do an RCT with a medical device. I mean, you either put a joint in or you don't. You can't leave somebody without a joint. And so there's very obvious differences. The US tech appraisers often may use the lack of a randomized controlled trial as a reason not to want to pay for or cover. And that's a real challenge, and that's one of the most proactive things you have to be able to overcome is defend not having, in some cases, an RCT and have a equally effective alternative. And that's where things like market research may come in to do as part of the planning for that.
So we've got regulatory reimbursement, and we've got some people that are actually like getting the product out there, right? I'm starting to believe that cross-functional training is almost becoming an imperative so that everybody understands. And I'm curious you had to get it over the hill. There wasn't a choice of not getting over the hill. How do you guys see that from having the experience of being inside?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the way we operate within our company, we operate as a startup. Within Otsuka, there's a pharmaceutical arm. We call ourselves the digital medicine business, as well as the medical device business, and we operate with all that cross-functional expertise all embedded within the team, from the clinical side, from the R&D side, from the sales and marketing and commercial side, from the health economics side of that. We're really a very integrated team, all working off the same page.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing, and I'd add that don't be afraid. We have medical advisory boards, science advisory boards, engineering advisory boards. We will have 10 or so persons deep with all kinds of backgrounds from different regulatory environments and or other companies that have been successful, and we bring them all in cross-functional reviews at the right time to actually give better feedback. Because we're often teaching the regulatory agencies, so we're doing something first at Lindra, other times I haven't, but we're often, if you are first, you're teaching at the same time. We invite regulators to come to our plants and learn from us.
So you're not Otsuka, and you're not 100 million, you don't have that sort of backing. You're a much smaller entity, and so what's your advice? From all of you, what do you say to the groups out there of how to drive this forward?
Well, I think I've been in consulting for about 8 years, and so those few years after kindergarten, when I worked in the medtech industry, a significant difference between biotech, biopharma, and medtech is the development cycle is typically a phase review process or a stage gate process. And you have to have representatives from all the functions around the table. Because if you've got the regulatory person over there saying, well, this is the intended use indication, whether it's a combination product or just a medical device, heaven forbid. So you have to make sure there's close interaction between R&D and marketing and manufacturing and regulatory and quality and clinical. And I think the med tech industry, simply because the way medical devices are developed, are more facile in that type of cross-functional interaction. And my personal experience with a lot of biotech and biopharma companies, they appear to be less so, more siloed and very protective of their own territory.
Yeah, I also think what Jessica brought up about, seeking outside, guidance. We've done that as well, knowing that data and how data is going to be utilized, and data is certainly a very hot topic in the media. We sought outside expertise to ensure that we handled the data situation. Yes, we know how to manage clinical data, but this is just a totally different game. And I think that going at it by yourself I don't see that being a viable model, even for the bigger companies. You need to have, I call it that cross-functional collaboration, both with internal and external.
And you have to be committed. This isn't the combination products. If it's worth doing, it's going to be hard, and it's going to take time, and it's not going to look at commercial as it did at phase 1. And if you are interested in having a big pharma buy you out, you better get some robust stuff, because most companies will come to big pharma and say, I need you to fund my animal studies, and then we'll go from here. And they have so much on their plate, and they're doing the same thing in all the franchises. They can't afford to do all new technology. So I think you've just got to have some grit and be committed and find really creative ways to get resources around the table to help you.
The other thing, go ahead.
All right, there's just the two caveats I'd add is one of the big differences in medical device space to me is that most companies, especially if they're smaller, aren't used to having the teams in place or an understanding of the need to develop the evidence that pharma and biotech have long been held accountable for. How many times have we seen 800 to 10,000 or more patient studies for a pharmaceutical or biotech product versus in medical device, if you've got 50 patients, you're doing really well. So making sure that there's that understanding that the paradigm has changed. There are increasing demands, especially in Europe, where the demands for CE are now changing to more stringent requirements for evidence design and development. The other caveat is that the team sizes typically in pharma and biotech are much larger. You have multiple hats you may wear in a medical device space, which means you may not be quite as expert in every element that you need. So you need to really rethink and work together well.
So are there one or two questions from the audience? I know we're between you and I think the networking break. See if we have any questions from the audience. Wow, you guys were great. You answered all their questions. They took this in by osmosis. Good? That's awesome. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.